Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Good to see you all here. My name is Erwin Maas. I'm an event curator at Studium Generale, Utrecht University's public platform for knowledge and reflection. I would also like to welcome those who are watching from home. Hi, everyone. If you have any questions or comments, please use the YouTube chat. My colleague will send them to me. And also, if you like our videos, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. Okay, those are the commercials. This is the second evening in a series of events about the legacy of the 9/11 attacks, which we organized together with the Contesting Governance Research Platform. Last time, historian Beatrice de Graaf talked about 9/11 as a turning point in history, and she argued that although it's too early to tell if it truly is a turning point, the way the West responded to the attacks wasn't unique and mirrors earlier unsuccessful attempts to end terrorism. Tonight, we will discuss how both public and private actors responded to the demand for security and safety all over the world. We'll start off by looking at the private security industry. And I have to say, as a frequent consumer of media, it's an industry you don't read or hear much about. And signs of its existence are just there when you visit a building like this. For example, there's a security guard. There are probably also cameras here. There's a camera over there, but maybe some security cameras as well. Anyway, after the 9/11 attacks, when the climate of fear took hold of the world, the private security industry grew immensely. It's very hard to find accurate and exact data, but a 2017 article in The Guardian argued that the global market for private security services is worth an estimated $240 billion. How did it get so big, and what does it mean that our security is guaranteed by commercial concerns? That's what our guest Tessa Diphoorn is going to talk about tonight. She is an anthropologist at Utrecht University whose research focuses on policing, security, violence, and power. Since last month, she's involved in an international project on algorithmic policing that focuses on the role of algorithmic governance in the private security industry in South Africa. She's also the co-host and co-founder of a podcast, Traveling Concepts on Air, about the way academic concepts travel across disciplines. Please give it up for Tessa Diphoorn.
Okay, am I on? Yes. Thank you, Erwin, for those kind words. Thank you for Studium Generale for having me here. And thank you also to my colleagues from the Contesting Governance Research Platform for co-organizing this event and having me kind of speak on your behalf. And of course, thank you to those watching from home for tuning in now or later. And I must say that I would never be classified as a soprano, but my voice is definitely huskier than it normally is. So I hope you can bear with me and that my voice will survive until the end of this evening. So, what are we going to talk about today? So today, as Erwin just mentioned, I will focus on the impact of 9/11 on the price of security. And more specifically, I will look at the growth and expansion of the private security industry. And for about over a decade, I have researched various parts of this industry. And as an anthropologist, perhaps not familiar with this term, but if you have questions, you can always ask me later. I've conducted ethnographic fieldwork on private security officers. So the actual officers that provide particular security services, such as these three men that you can see on this photo. These are three security officers that I spent a lot of time with during my fieldwork in South Africa, which entailed that I accompanied them on their everyday patrols. I tried to understand what do they do, why do they do it, how do they do it, and how do they experience this, and how does this shape kind of the larger security spectrum. And my research has primarily focused on South Africa and Kenya, but I've also conducted research in South Sudan, Jamaica, and Israel. So let me immediately, take you to one of my field sites and give you a little bit of insight into the type of research that I do. So this is Westgate, It is one of the many malls in Nairobi, Kenya. And many of you maybe have heard of it because it was also the site of a terrorist attack in September 2013, where 71 people were killed and approximately 200 people were seriously wounded. Most notoriously, it was also an ordeal that lasted several days, and the army came, and it was quite an affair, so to speak. And it was eventually claimed by Al-Shabaab, an organization primarily operating in the Horn of Africa. So about 2 years later, in 2015, I was in Nairobi to do research on the private security industry. And during my time there, the mall had reopened. And this was, of course, a very big affair. For 2 years, the building had kind of defined for many a very traumatic moment. And a lot of people still to this day refuse to enter this new building. And I had the chance to interview the security manager of the mall. And he gave me a tour of the new mall and was highlighting particularly all of the new things that they had implemented to ensure that a terrorist attack would not happen again. And he particularly focused on the new security equipment that they had installed. And we talked about his history, how he got involved in the industry, etc. And he then stated to me, after 9/11, security became something different. And people started to make a lot of money. Now, this sentiment has been echoed by people working in the industry from across the globe during interviews that I've conducted in numerous different places, namely that 9/11 has resulted in the increasing commodification of security, which refers to the ways in which security is increasingly framed and treated as a product that can be sold for a particular price. So today I want to show that to you by zooming in on this industry, giving you a glimpse of what this industry entails, but perhaps more importantly, showing you what the consequences of the growth of this industry has been on the questions of state authority, the aesthetics of the urban landscape, and of course the consolidation or perhaps even exacerbation of social inequalities. So, what does this industry look like? So, within the industry, a common distinction is made between private military companies and private security companies. Now, there are also companies that are engaged in both activities, so it's not always just clear-cut, but this distinction holds for most of the time. Private military companies, as the name suggests, are companies that provide military-type services, so armed combat, military training, maintenance of military equipment, logistical support, etc. They are often referred to as defense contractors or security contractors, corporate soldiers, mercenaries, soldiers for hire, etc. Now, these companies have received a lot of attention throughout the years, particularly for certain incidents in Iraq and Afghanistan. Perhaps some of you may have heard of the incident in Nisour Square, where a company, Blackwater, now known as Academy, received a lot of attention after 17 Iraqis were killed by Blackwater employees. In addition to their role in armed conflicts, these companies also play a role in, for example, anti-piracy efforts in the Gulf of Eden. But they're also recruited by a lot of humanitarian organizations, such as the United Nations, to protect personnel and assist in conflict and assets in conflict areas, such as Congo, Somalia, South Sudan. Unsurprisingly, perhaps, the United States is the world's largest consumer of private military services. This is most notably the case in Iraq and Afghanistan, as we can see here from the graph. I hope it's clear for all of you. And what we see here in this graph is, of course, the presence of US armed forces in both countries. But we see that after 2007, the US armed forces became vastly outnumbered by private contractors, further explaining or showing how these companies played a large role in everyday military affairs. Now, in addition to these military companies, we also have private security companies that focus more on kind of policing-like activities, such as access control, guarding, surveillance, as Erwin said as well, responsible for the installation of CCTV cameras, alarm systems, etc. And generally, they're regarded as less dangerous, less sensational. I argue, along with others, that these companies actually play a much larger and more prominent role in our daily lives. And that we actually, people such as you and I, actually deal with these people on a much more regular basis. Things may be a little bit different in COVID times, but think about the people who control the contents of your luggage at the airport, or the warden who checks your pass at a football stadium a football stadium, the bouncer at a nightclub, or perhaps even the janitor that you may have seen when you entered this building. This is Eric. He allowed me to take this photo of him last week, so I have full permission to have him here on this PowerPoint. Eric works for Securitas, which is one of the 400 companies in the Netherlands. He's one of the 32,000 employees in the Netherlands working for such companies. Securitas is also one of the largest companies worldwide, operating with 300 staff members across 48 different countries. Another major companies are ADT, but particularly also G4S, which stands for Group for Secure Corps, which is a British-owned multinational company which operates as a major economic power at the global level. They're a major provider of airport security, but they're also heavily involved in providing security at prisons, courtrooms, asylum-seeking centers, rehabilitation centers, etc. And in 2012, they were the official security provider of the London Olympic Games, which made them, in that year, the largest private employer of Europe. So combined, both military and private security companies, we have basically an industry, as Erwin mentioned, which was estimated to have a global value of $180 billion in 2017. And this is a number that's greater than the GDP of 100 countries, so Portugal, Romania, and Hungary, for example. Furthermore, it has yearly growth rates between around approximately 6%, which is faster than the global economy as a whole. Basically meaning this industry is not going anywhere, but is only much more likely to play a more prominent role in our lives as in the future to come. So what we basically see is a massive industry operating at a global level and providing a wide range of services. Now, this industry, of course, also existed before 9/11. Yet 9/11 did initiate a massive boom within this industry, as was highlighted by the security manager of the Westgate shopping mall when he said people started to make a lot of money. Now, in the second part of this talk, I want to show what the impact of this growth has been on our daily lives and our understanding of security. So, the most obvious question, at least it was the most obvious question for me and for many other people who do research in this industry, is what does this mean for the role of the state? So the idea that there are private actors fighting a war in our name, or private security officers providing protection during or after a crime has been committed, this somehow defies our very kind of traditional Eurocentric Westphalian idea of the state as the exclusive sovereign power over its territory. And as we can see from the graph here, again, I hope it's clear for everybody, in many countries, private security officers vastly outnumber the state police. If we look at India, for example, there are approximately 7 million security officers to 1.4 million police officers. And for many people, this is an indication of state failure. So the state is failing to provide safety for its citizens. However, the reality is in most countries that this has been a direct result of outsourcing, a part of the larger kind of neoliberal paradigm whereby the state extends its sovereignty to other actors. Similar to many other sectors within our society, security has been increasingly privatized. And so one of the things that I've been interested in my research is trying to understand how these different actors connect and relate to each other. So what is the relationship between the industry and the state police? And this is the photo, which is the photo, one of my photos that I took in Nairobi. We see the vehicle of a local private security company, KK Security, which is posted at Loresho Police Post, which is a police station. And what happens a lot in Nairobi is that police officers and private security companies conduct patrols together, for example. In South Africa, this also happens a lot, and in South Africa, actually all police stations are guarded by security officers from private security companies. So there's various different ways in which these two bodies or these two agencies are interconnected. And it forces us to think beyond the state when we think about security. Now, one of the questions emerging from all these is, of course, what does this mean for responsibility and accountability? Now, a lot of the research on private security, particularly military security, focuses on this element, namely regulation. This is particularly a field for legal scholars, which I'm definitely not. I want to make clear that that's not my expertise. I think my esteemed colleague will be able to answer some questions about that if need be. But I do think it's important to mention that several countries, such as South Africa, have a legal regulatory authority that stipulates how these companies should operate. Yet actually many countries lack any regulatory authority, which means that a lot of these private security operators are able to operate without any form of actual oversight. On an international level, things are even more complicated. Now, during the recent years, there have been a lot of efforts to somehow regulate these companies. And there are three key initiatives worth mentioning. And the first is the Montreux document, which describes international humanitarian law and human rights law that can be applied to the activities of these companies. It also contains a whole list of good practices to kind of assist states in implementing their obligations under international law. On the map next to it, you can see the amount of countries that have ratified this agreement, showing that there's quite some work to do in this sense. There's also the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Service Providers, which articulates kind of a set of standards for these companies to ensure that they comply with international humanitarian law. However, when preparing for this talk, I saw on the website that 7 states and 100 companies have signed this Code of Conduct. Again, a lot more work left to do when it comes to regulation. Now, in addition to these questions of state authority, regulation, and oversight, one of the things that I've been more interested in my research is what is the impact of this commodification on broader social inequalities. Now, in an article by The Guardian from 2017, the industry was called the Industry of Inequality. Because the reality is that as a product, security is not affordable to everybody. In many parts of the world, private security is a luxury good reserved solely for the elite. And in other places, such as South Africa, an alarm system is a common household item for many middle-class families, for example. Yet nevertheless, there are always people who are unable to afford these services and are, as a result, forced to resort to other means for a sense of safety. And what you can see in many different urban centers across the globe is that different forms of protection or security are a reflection of social divides within a particular society. And this is often very physically visible. Take a look at some of these photos, the drone photos. They've been taken by a photographer, Johnny Miller, who wanted to document social inequality through drone photographs, showing kind of how social inequalities can be reflected into the kind of the spatial segregation within cities. And the private security infrastructure plays a very prominent role in this picture here. So the high walls, the barbed wires, the enclosures, they reinforce existing social divides within urban communities. And this has been a topic that many anthropologists have looked into. These are 2 examples of books, Behind the Gates and City of Walls, which are beautiful ethnographies for those who are interested in this work, who basically show how citizens retreat into these residential enclaves and the impact this has on dismantling social relations and ties across various communities. What is also important to recognize is that such security infrastructure also very much shapes our experience of an urban, or it doesn't have to be urban, primarily urban space, and our perceptions of fear. Because those walls are designed to protect some people, but they're also designed to keep others out. And they're designed to keep those out that are considered to be dangerous. Now, this is a photo of a sign that I took in South Africa, which was very common in many parts of the country, basically saying, "Be warned, criminals will not be tolerated," with a very punitive tone accompanying it, basically making clear that certain people are not welcome. And the framing of this dangerous criminal other has very much been shaped by 9/11. I think in our next seminar by Marieke de Goede in this series, we'll hear more about the ways in which people who are suspected of being a terrorist, most often Muslims, are treated. Now in Kenya, due to the role of Al-Shabaab as a primarily Somali-based organization, the dangerous other is primarily the Somali-looking man. And there's a lot of research that's documented the way in which these men have been targeted. In South Africa, despite the efforts that have been implemented to undo the legacies of apartheid, in my research, I identified how the dangerous criminal other was almost always the poor young black man. To illustrate this, when I went on patrols with private security officers, we would regularly get calls in about suspicious Bravo mics. Now, private security officers used phonetic alphabet when communicating with each other. So the Bravo mic refers to black males. And they would often be called in to come and see what a black man who was walking down the street or was basically in a space that he presumably wasn't supposed to be, and therefore incited suspicion. Unsurprisingly, during my fieldwork, I never once encountered an incident where someone called in for a suspicious whiskey mic or a suspicious white male. And in an article that you can see here, I coined this the Bravo mic syndrome. And I show how racial and ethnic profiling is also very much a part of the private security culture. And I think this is very important for us to take note of in the current debate on ethnic profiling, also here in the Netherlands. And to recognize that the private security industry also plays a large role in this and should not be excluded when we look at these processes of exclusion. Now, a key question I often get is whether all of this, these walls, these alarm systems, these patrols, these private security officers, do they actually make the world a safer place? This is, of course, an impossible question to answer, because what does it mean to be safe? But if I had to answer it, I would say no. At least the industry has certainly not allowed us to believe that the world is a safer place. Because many security companies invest heavily in marketing strategies, continuously reminding us that we definitely need that alarm system in our house. And if one were to take a very critical, perhaps cynical perspective, one could argue that it's also in the best interest of these companies that we remain fearful. And the problem with security is also its utopian core and never-ending possibilities. Can anyone ever feel too secure? There is always room for more equipment, for newer high-tech systems, as was made clear to me by the security manager of the Westgate shopping mall. And I think, as scholars, it's important for us to critically analyze these developments. So let's go back to Westgate and also round off my talk for today. Let's go back to the security manager who, with pride, showed how the mall could never be the site of another terrorist attack. Yet for many Kenyans, particularly Nairobians, when they hear or think of Westgate, they don't think of the shiny new gadgets in the mall, but they think of the images of this burning building and many of the other traumatic photos that circulated during and after this tragic affair. And I think in line with this, I think it's important for us to recognize that 9/11 was and is very much a Western experience. Now, I know this seminar series is trying to show the tremendous global impact this had, which I've also tried to show here today. We should not forget the fact that there are many other 9/11s, so to speak. This is also what the same security manager said to me when he said, we also have our own 9/11. He was not only referring to, of course, the role of the Westgate Mall attack in Kenyan politics, but also hinting towards the differences between local and regional dynamics in trying to understand not only the impact of 9/11, but also in trying to understand the commodification of security. Yet eventually, whether we're in Nairobi, Tokyo, New York, Amsterdam, for us all, security comes at a price, and it's not very likely to change anytime soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tessa. Please join me here.
Mm-hmm.
So the title of the Guardian article that you mentioned, and I mentioned it as well in my introduction, it's The Industry of Inequality. That's what you mentioned as well. And the rest of the title is Why the World is Obsessed with Private Security. Of course, you mentioned the outsourcing by governments, and you also mentioned the industry's sort of commercial power, the advertisement. Is that why the world is so obsessed with private security?
Yes. Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why we are all obsessed with private security, but I do think that these are the very prominent things that play a role. So this general outsourcing, so this idea also that this kind of neoliberalization of security, so this idea that security is everybody's responsibility. It is no longer, we shouldn't only look to the state to provide this for us. I think this is a key role, and I think also there's very much this fear-enhancing idea that we have, this idea that the world is getting unsafer. Well, I mean, this is a different talk, but I mean, there's a lot of research showing that in many parts of the world is not getting unsafer. No. Yet we have this idea that it is, and we resort to extra forms of security to try and make ourselves feel safer.
So it's not just a sort of a gap that they fill, that governments fill to jump into.
Well, I mean, of course, it's a little bit of everything. So, I mean, there are, of course, cases where, I mean, there are many parts of the world where police forces are under-resourced or undermanned and are unable to provide and fill the expectations of citizens. I mean, this is, you know, the legitimacy of the police is very questionable on many levels. Yet I do think that it's a combination of both. So, and in most countries you see that the state is actively allowing and encouraging companies to exist and to flourish in various ways.
Are there also examples of situations when a private security clashes with public security?
Yes. In many parts of the world, this happens a lot, yeah. And in my research in Kenya and South Africa, I witnessed this on numerous occasions where there would be, there's competition at times, there's rivalry, there's issues of hierarchy. So yeah, it's not always a very symbiotic relationship, no.
Could you name an example?
An example of a private security officer arresting somebody and the police officer saying that it's not their authority to do so, patrolling an area where the police officer says that they couldn't patrol an area. These kinds of stepping on each other's turfs, so to speak. Yeah.
I was also wondering, that was also something that came up in the Guardian article, was that it suggested that the private security industry doesn't merely produce inequality, but it's also perhaps a consequence of inequality, of the haves trying to protect what they have from the have-nots. Do you agree with that?
Yes, and I mean, when I was living in South Africa, I myself was a consumer of private security, so it's also a very understandable, sorry, my voice is failing me now. It's a very understandable and a very human reaction as well. So yes, but the fact that I can afford something more than someone else, it reconsolidates it. So it produces it consolidates existing inequalities, and I think exacerbates them at the same time. So yes, I would definitely agree with that.
Are there also colleagues in your field of research who have some good solutions for this problem to regulate the private security industry more? Yes,
and I mean, I'm actually so the South African system that I briefly mentioned is actually quite a robust legislation that has quite an extensive oversight body. But it's one of the very few countries that has this. So I think the actual establishment of such a regulatory authority is the first step. And the Montreux document that I showed, there's a lot of international pressure for states to ratify this. So there's definitely a lot of lobbying happening from many parts, primarily lawyers, who are trying to establish this. So that's definitely taking place, yeah.
So I'm curious, you're a cultural anthropologist. How does a cultural anthropologist study security? I mean, you mentioned sort of going along with these private security officers. How does your research work?
That's a really, do we have several hours to discuss
well, yes.
How does this work? Well, I think as anthropologists, we're very much interested in understanding social dynamics, social relations, trying to explain how things work, how people give meaning to their lives. And the first time I went to South Africa, I was immediately flabbergasted and interested in this massive industry, seeing armed men everywhere. And it triggered something inside me that I thought, I want to understand how this works. Who are the men that are doing this? What are their relationships? What are their own perceptions? What are their own experiences? And I think this is a common thing for anthropologists to look at and to analyze.
Yeah.
How did it work?
Yeah.
Well, it works in a lot of ways. But one of the things was indeed accompanying these men on their patrols and literally sitting in a car with them and looking at what they do, asking them questions, and hanging out. It's a key anthropological term. We hang out. Yeah.
That's what you do. But you had some sort of hypothesis, I would say.
No, not necessarily. I mean, a lot of anthropological work is very inductive, so it's very much kind of grounded theory ideas. So you, of course, you go to the field with certain ideas and assumptions and questions, but it's very much about allowing the data to speak to you in a way, and to from there, at least this is how anthropology. There's a lot of diversity within anthropology, of course. I have some colleagues in the room who could speak to that. But I mean, it's the idea is that the data, from that data you start analyzing it and you use it to try to understand larger questions about our society and about, in my question, about security, power, authority, these types of things.
And would you say that these sort of this meaning-giving process, so we give meaning to security, is that very different between countries and the countries that you've researched?
Yes, and there's also very different ideas about what security should be. Yeah. There's very different ideas about who we want to give us that security. So there's very different empirical realities, but there are, of course, some. I think this is one of the key things that I tried to end off with, is so we can see certain global patterns and certain global trajectories, but they're also kind of fed by different local realities. So it's a kind of interaction between the two, so to speak.
Mm-hmm. Are there any questions for Tessa? Yes.
Yes, well, perhaps it's a pretty naive question, I don't know. It has its roots probably from me having grown up in a country where there's relatively little violence or insecurity. But I wonder whether the price of more and more visible security measures isn't actually that people would feel less secure being presented with all the measurements that they see. Because that's an effect it has on me personally. For instance, when I'm at the airport and I see a lot of military or employees, I actually start to wonder, is there something going on?
Maybe we can ask the rest of the audience as well. Who feels more secure at an airport when you see a guard? Who feels less secure? Okay. Yeah, a lot of guards, and machine guns and whatever, yeah.
Okay. Well, I think the indication of the responses from the group show that there's different reactions to this. I mean, there's actually a lot of research that shows that people feel more secure when there's more police on the streets. I think this is also reflected in across cultures, because a lot of people also have bad interactions with the police. So for them, seeing more police on the streets is an indication that they are more likely to be harmed than protected. So this question is, of course, very subjective and very much based on our own experiences with security forces, more broadly speaking. But I would agree with you. This is, as I mentioned, this was something that I was triggered by when I first went to South Africa. And I thought, how is this? This is not. I mean, there's so much security everywhere. But the interesting thing about it is that when you live in it, it also becomes normalized. So to have a security officer patrol your neighborhood, to have an alarm system, all of this becomes a part of your everyday reality. And when it's taken away from you, it also makes you feel kind of bare and insecure. And you see also that the growth of private security very much happens as kind of a domino effect, right? So you might have a street where there's very little private security, but then one house will have it, then the other house will have it. And then by the end, you might be the only house. And if you get robbed, then it'll be like, well, you didn't get private security, and so and this is literally how it works, and it becomes this collective fear as well. So it's not only something that's experienced individually, but it's very much a collective process as well.
Any other questions? Yes.
Okay, shall I just talk a bit like this? Thank you, Tessa, for your talk. I wanted to kind of add, you already asked about solutions. I was just curious, next to these codes of conduct, what could we as consumers perhaps do of private security, or alternatively, how did you manage this when you were consuming private security, when you were living in South Africa or Kenya?
Well, that's a very good question. I think as a consumer, I decided to not get involved at all, because whenever I told people what I was researching, I would always get, so which company's the best? Who should I subscribe to? Like, who's the most responsive? And it was, of course, a question that I didn't want to answer, so I just kind of let that go when I was there. But actually, in the South African regulatory system, consumers can be held liable if they knowingly recruit a company that underpays their guards, for example. They can receive a fine. Now, research has shown that this actually has minimal impact, but there is even kind of legal frameworks that can make consumers liable for these things. I don't think we have that in the Netherlands. Again, I think the South African system is quite robust, despite the fact that it's not always implemented. But there is definitely, I mean, just like as a consumer, we can choose to recruit to how should I say it, to recruit certain companies and not others. But yeah, there's something that we can do, but it's also limited in a certain extent. Yeah.
I know you're not the owner of a private security company,
I'm not,
but
no.
I was wondering.
I could be.
You could be. Are there any areas where you see even more growth of this industry in the future?
Well, actually, while preparing for this, I saw that one of the biggest markets now is kind of post-authoritarian regimes. And so the way private security operates is different in many parts of the world. I know that many Eastern European countries and also Russia, it's kind of it's semi-state owned, so they're semi-private. It's a much more complicated situation. But there are definitely still growing markets. India has been in the last 10 years a massive booming market, and I know that even within African countries. So some countries, such as South Africa, the industry has existed for much longer, but there are countries where you can see that in the last 10, 20 years. And again, I do think, that 9/11 was for many countries a reason, but also countries that had their own kind of terrorist attacks. That definitely prompted some. I mean, in Kenya, it was 9/11 that played a role, but it was definitely the Westgate attack that also had a prominent effect.
Yeah. We're going to go to Jan-Jaap in a second, but maybe because I read you're doing this research on algorithmic policing, and I was thinking maybe that was one of the areas that this industry is sort of expanding into.
Yeah. Oh, you mean like that? So where's the? Oh, okay. Sorry, I thought you meant countries.
No,
no, definitely.
Like
in terms of technological advancements, this is definitely where the industry is growing. Yeah. I haven't yet done the research about algorithms, so I have no empirical data to share with you, unfortunately. Maybe in 2 years, maybe. But definitely the technological field, that industry, to give it a big name, is definitely where the private security industry is experiencing growth, unquestionably, yeah. And
could you tell us just in a few sentences what algorithmic policing is?
It's basically, so one of the things that I'll be looking at is the way in which algorithms are used to target particular suspects. So one of the things that I would be interested in is whether this kind of Bravo Mike syndrome that I've written about earlier, whether it's being kind of shaped to a certain degree by the use of algorithms.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. We'll go on to Jan-Jaap, but we'll turn our attention to 9/11 and how it affected the methods and the authorities of intelligence and security services, so the public actors. So in the US, the global war on terror made the way for a huge expansion of the power of security services. Everything was put in order to end terrorism, even if it undermined the privacy of citizens and their human rights. But what happened in the Netherlands? Did our security services get more authorities? And how do you create a fair balance between security on the one hand and privacy and human rights on the other? So that's what our next guest is going to talk about, Jan-Jaap Oerlemans. He is an endowed professor in intelligence and law at Utrecht University, where he studies the relationship between the digitalization of intelligence and the law. And he also works for the Commissie van Toezicht op de Inlichting en Veiligheidsdiensten, which is a government commission that checks if security and intelligence services aren't crossing any legal lines. So please give a warm round of applause for Jan-Jaap Oerlemans.
So thank you. Yeah, can we put my presentation up? Then
yes. You can just. Yeah.
There it is. All right. Thank you. Yeah. So on my first slide, you can see maybe already an iconic symbol. Who in the room recognizes the symbol of? It's a prism.
Prism.
Yeah. What do you think of? Does it have to do with mass surveillance? Yes or no? Yeah? So who recognizes this as one of the NSA programs on mass surveillance? Please raise your hand. Yeah, some. There are less maybe than I thought, but I mean, this is my area of interest, so I'm triggered by a symbol like this. The PRISM is one of the programs that the NSA used to conduct bulk interception, basically. PRISM was a program more on national electronic communication service providers, such as Google and Apple, and basically what they have done is that they use a program where they say, we suspect these people of terrorism or aiding terrorism, and we request a warrant of a certain court, and then these companies has to monitor traffic of these users, and the national security National Security Agency, the NSA, can then analyze the data that they gather. And it's a form of mass surveillance and one of these kind of programs that I would like to talk with you about tonight. You may think that the NSA is a intelligence, we call them a communication intelligence security service that collects everything of all communications of everyone. That's not the case, and I can tell you a bit about that, but also how it relates to foreigners versus Americans, and all in the aftermath of 9/11. So basically, when you think of 9/11, I think most people will think about the Patriot Act, of course. You know, the Patriot Act is something that came on in October of 2001, so very early on after 9/11. There was some debate about it in the United States that whether they should adopt the Patriot Act or not, because what it did, it is expanded the powers mostly of the executive branch of the president of the United States to take measures of all means necessary to track down the people who attacked the World Trade Center. So it was he started a war on terror, and he used legislation to give him more power to combat it. So what it meant is that security and intelligence services had to work together to fight terrorism and do something about it. But you have to imagine that most debate in the US was about surveillance on Americans and not about foreigners. And that's something that I want to make clear, is that there are safeguards also in US national security legislation or mass surveillance measures and regulating it, but there are less safeguards, if any, when it regards non-Americans or foreigners or surveillance on foreign territory. So I will talk with you about that. Later on in my presentation, I will talk also about Dutch mass surveillance law, Dutch national security law, and a little bit about criminal law relating to combating terrorism. You may be familiar or may not be familiar with Fisa. Fisa is an act that regulates foreign intelligence, so gathering intelligence sometimes outside the United States, sometimes inside the United States, but it's targeted at foreigners. And then we could go back on PRISM again, because what it did is that PRISM was focused on foreign targets, so non-Americans who might want to commit a terrorist attack in the United States. And then a court, the Fisa court, has to authorize the surveillance of these persons. So there is a safeguard here, but it's not particularly focused, because it's about bulk interception. It's about lots and lots of data that's being collected and then analyzed by analysts at the National Security Agency. There's a specific section within Fisa, section 702, and that makes clear that when it's about surveillance outside the United States, there's basically no warrant required to collect the data. So there's not a judge that authorizes a warrant who says, well, these individuals pose a threat to national security, and therefore we can monitor their communications. Some provisions of the Patriot Acts no longer exist. They were expired. There was a so-called sunset clause after 5 years to evaluate, do we want to keep the Patriot Act and the amendments it had. Many of them are expired by now, but many of the amendments to the Fisa Act still remain. So it's been reauthorized, and it still is there until the December 31. When you think of the Netherlands and 9/11, I think many people have a kind of Patriot Act in their minds. People think about the expanding powers that were given to the president in the United States and the National Security Agency, and probably many people think that a similar thing happened in the Netherlands. I want to make clear that I think quite the opposite is the case in the Netherlands. We have an Act on Security and Intelligence Services in the Netherlands. We had one in 1987, and now we have one in. Then we had one in 2002, and now we have one from 2017. But the Act in 2002 basically strengthened fundamental rights of people who were being involved in surveillance measures of intelligence and security services. Because what this act did, it regulated the intelligence methods that intelligence and security services use, and we regulate them as powers. And we do that to make clear how far intelligence and security services can go, what kind of intelligence methods they can use, and you create safeguards to prevent misuse of powers. And part of that is, for example, oversight also to check for misuse. It still took a long time, so only since 2002 we have an act regulating these kind of powers, and we have a form of oversight. So it only started in the Netherlands in 2002, but it did not expand the existing surveillance powers that were used. So what this law did, it regulates things like hacking as a power. You can hack a mobile phone of an individual to learn a lot about the individual, but you can also hack a computer at an internet service provider in order to collect much more information. And all this was possible since 2002. Like I said, the creation of oversight is also important, because without oversight you cannot control whether intelligence and security services meet the regulations. Practice must meet how it's stipulated in law, so you need to check it for it. In the Netherlands, I work at such an oversight body, so I know how intelligence and security services use and whether they uphold the law or not. And in the Netherlands, the oversight body can talk to individuals who work in intelligence and security services, and they can check documents located there, and then they write a public report about whether they acted lawfully or unlawfully, and they send it to Parliament to discuss it. And that's the way we regulated the use of mass surveillance powers, and we have oversight on it. The thing is that every country regulates it in their own way. So it's very much something that states themselves decide how they regulate the use of powers of intelligence security services. Why that is, I'm not really sure. For example, when you look at the European Union, it's clear they do not have jurisdiction to regulate surveillance powers. It's something that's left to the states to decide for themselves. Of course, we have things like the European Court on Human Rights and human rights treaties, and those pose certain obligations for states to meet, and they have to uphold to those kind of standards. But still, it leaves a lot of leeway to states to regulate it in their own way. And of course, it's difficult to compare the United States, for example, with the Netherlands, because the United States is its whole own system to regulate the use of surveillance powers. So, for example, in the United States, they have many internal guidelines and internal audits and oversight bodies, but less external compared to the Netherlands, for example. When you look at 9/11 and what it meant for the Netherlands, there are some actions, and I think surveillance has increased on people, and we gave the government more powers to combat terrorism. But I think these measures were not in our Act on Intelligence Security Services, but more in the criminal law domain and the administrative domain. So we think of criminal law to tackle, combat terrorist crimes. One of these acts is the Terrorist Act of 2004. An important one was the creation of it's a counter-terrorism information box, it's called, but it's about information sharing on individuals who threat national security or want to engage in terrorist crimes. But these terrorist acts, what they meant is that law enforcement can start an investigation earlier than normally. So normally, you have a reasonable suspicion a person committed a crime. When a terrorist investigation started, you have indication a person is about to commit a crime. So you can start investigations more early on than in regular criminal investigations. This legislation in the Netherlands has been evaluated a couple of times, and it shows that some measures are used more often. For example, the information box was used often. However, the ability to start criminal investigations earlier in criminal investigations was not used as often. And legal scholars such as Maarten van der Woude from Leiden University wrote extensively about that. Also, Corien Eijkman wrote about that, and Bart Schuurman also from the Leiden University. And it's interesting to evaluate these kind of measures because you need to know, do they work? Do we need to adapt them? We need to create more safeguards to protect fundamental rights or not. And I think what you can see is that once these acts are created, they're usually not, you don't go back to the original situation. So they still exist, even when the threat to national security or terrorist threat changes in time. There are also many, many different administrative measures relating to illegal immigration or joining a jihad and taking away the nationality of people once they join the jihad, for example. And those are also seriously interfere in the fundamental rights of individuals, for example. But my expertise is more about surveillance law of the intelligence and security services. I think not so much 9/11 was a major influencer for anti-terrorism legislation in the Netherlands and or relating to our Act on Intelligence and Security Services. It's more the attacks in the EU that influence those. And I think, I can mention many of them, but the major attacks were, of course, in Madrid in 2004, in London, July 2005. Think of Charlie Hebdo in January 2015, Bataclan in November 2015, in Brussels Airport, March 2016. And many smaller attacks where only a couple of individuals died, and in many different countries. Of course, in Utrecht there was also a small terrorist attack that also left scars, I think, in Dutch society. But these attacks, and especially the Madrid and London attacks, also ignited EU legislation to combat terrorism, but also different crimes. And that kind of legislation also influenced, of course, Dutch legislation to fight terrorism. So we can think, for example, of a early decision following the 9/11 attacks, but basically what it did is created a list of terrorist organizations. I think a bigger impact on fundamental rights has the Data Retention Directive. That's about storing telecommunications data, so in advance before crimes occur. So when a crime occurs, you can collect that data and see, for example, where a mobile phone of a person was exactly when in time, and who did someone call with at what time and date, and etc. So that's very useful for law enforcement, but it was deemed in violation with the right to privacy, and the data retention directive was annulled. But you can also think, for example, of other EU measures that are more focused, creating a coordinator on terrorism within office, and trying to coordinate different actions by different member states of the EU to combat terrorism. And a major one is our passenger name records. So that's basically personal information that's stored when people fly into an airport on the EU or fly outside an airport of the EU. And that information is stored so it can be used later by law enforcement authorities, and often also by intelligence and security services. But then, of course, in June 2017, Snowden happened. And I think that's also of influence when we talk about legislation for mass surveillance. The Snowden revelations showed some of the programs of the National Security Agency. They monitored internet traffic on a very large scale, and they used it to analyze this information to combat terrorism, but also, of course, for other goals like contra-espionage and stuff like that. It influenced also public debates outside the United States, and also influenced mass surveillance law. For example, in the UK, there were Investigatory Powers Act was created, and it had much more stringent safeguards than before. So now, for some surveillance measures, prior authorization is required. There's very strong oversight, and basically oversight for all public authorities that engage in intelligence gathering. It also influenced the debate in the Netherlands a bit. And do you remember perhaps why we had a referendum at a certain point in time? Does anyone know? Yeah, the slave vet. We had a referendum on our Act on Intelligence and Security Services in May 2018, and I believe that the Snowden revelations and the information about bulk interception of internet traffic definitely influenced the Dutch public debate also about this law. So a couple of students of University of Amsterdam, they started a petition that we should have a referendum on this particular act. At some point, they had enough signatures, and we did indeed have a referendum about the Act on Security and Intelligence Services. The thing was, the Act was already passed in 2017, and then we had the referendum, so it halted before it entered into force. The result of the referendum was that more people voted against, and I think 49% voted against this act, and lesser, like 47% or 46%, voted for this act. And it was important because this act, it made it possible for our intelligence security services to engage in bulk interception of internet traffic. But I think maybe not many people realize that they already were able to do so, but only for communications that flow through the air, basically, like mobile communications or satellite communications. So bulk interception was already possible, but this new act made it possible to also engage on bulk interception on cables to collect internet traffic. But that was not the only thing that this new act made possible. It also created new safeguards when we engage, when you use powers of bulk interception, for example. So now for many, we call it specialized powers or special powers for intelligence security services. Now prior authorization is required, and when no authorization is there is no authorization, then the power cannot be used. So, for example, our intelligence security agencies want to engage in bulk interception, or they want to hack a computer. They have to ask for authorization of the director of the service. They have to ask for authorization of the responsible minister, so the Ministry of Interior Affairs or Defense. And they have to get authorization of this new oversight body that's been created. When they use the power in practice, there is another oversight body, where I work, who then checks it on whether it's conducted lawfully and as agreed upon, basically. So it's really stringent, I think. And for me, creating this new oversight body, and also amending current legislation to make clear what the services can do, under which circumstances, and more amended to our digital context, like how you can use it online and stuff. For me, it was an important reason why I was in favor of this new act. So to conclude, what I wanted to make clear in my short presentation, I'm sure you have questions later on, is that I think 9/11 clearly significantly impacted the powers of intelligence security services in the United States. They were more focused on jihadist terrorism. They were able to share more data between state agencies. They had more budget, and the law was amended so they had greater powers. I do not think it significantly impacted the surveillance powers in the Netherlands. I think more so terrorist attacks within the European ignited new legislation to combat terrorism, but not so much on our Act on Security and Intelligence Services. So yeah, thanks for your attention, and I'm glad to answer questions of you.
Please take a seat. Maybe it's a bit of a stupid question to a government employee, which you are, I would say. Are you happy with the way security services are being regulated at the moment? Is it perfect?
No, it's not perfect, but I think any legal scholar or lawyer will say no, it's not perfect, because you can always improve legislation. So you can make legislation better. I think in part you can amend legislation to be more clear about what our intelligence security services can do exactly. For example, online. I think my inaugural lecture, for example, was about a very unclear power. It's not a special investigative power that requires prior authorization and stuff, but it was about we call it an informant power. And basically it enables governmental institutions to be an informant to intelligence and security services. And what happened is that it was not PNR data, but other air flight information. That was, airline companies have to store personal information about people who are taking flights. It was sent to our military police. And then they provided that information to our intelligence security services. And it was about data of millions of people, so it was bulk. In my inaugural lecture, I made clear I think we should regulate this much better. You should make clear that this is indeed a possibility. You should think about possible safeguards. You should think about how you deal with that kind of data. We need, for example, a retention period of data. We don't have in our law you can store data for an X amount of years. For example, maybe it's 30 years, but the law doesn't say so. You can keep it until it's no longer of meaning to the intelligence security services. So those are small things, but I think it should be improved in our legislation. Yeah.
So the intelligence services weren't allowed to collect certain information, but governments could, and so they found a way to get to those to that data.
Yeah. Yeah, so they were able to gather it more easily in larger amounts than they could themselves, probably. And they had the power to do so. They were authorized to do so. Our legislation made it possible, but I think also digitization or computers and internet sometimes make it possible to collect more information than 20 years ago in 2002. So sometimes you have to amend laws to rethink, do we still allow this or do we restrict it?
Yeah.
But it's not only about privacy, it's also about does this 2017 Act still work for intelligence security services? So there's been an evaluation also about this Act, and they basically said you have to amend, for example, data analysis regulations because they're too stringent right now, and it hampers the work of intelligence security services, and therefore we need to amend legislation to make it work better for them. So it's both ways, and we have to critically assess whether that's a good idea or not. We always need to meet fundamental rights, they're also set in international treaties and in case law, and you always have to keep that in mind.
Yeah, there was an accident this year. NRC newspaper revealed that the Dutch counter-terrorist organization, the NCTV, they unlawfully followed citizens for years, and they shared this information with other parties. And then the government did a law proposal to legitimate these practices. What do you think of that?
It's a difficult discussion because our national coordinator on terrorism has some very important tasks. For example, protect our politician and coordinate after a terrorist attack occurred in the Netherlands, for example. You do need powers to deal with those responsibilities. But this was about monitoring online behavior of people where they already had information on, so they want to enrich the information they already had. And when you monitor the behaviors of people online, it infringes in the right to privacy. And perhaps you can say, well, maybe a Google search on someone, you probably Googled me before I arrived here. It infringes to our right to privacy only minimally, and maybe governmental officials will be allowed to do so also. When you collect all information that people post online on social media and you record it, you store it in a file, then the infringement becomes a lot bigger, and the information that has been stored can be used against these people later on, for example, in procedures against the government. So then you need to regulate it properly.
So that's what the NCTV did?
The newspaper articles say that the NCTV did monitor the social behaviors of people systematically, and some people they ask for their files, using a data access request basically, and they said, well, you see, they did monitor my account systematically, and they did not have a legal basis to do so. And what legislator, they created hastily a law to give that vital power to the National Coordinator on Intelligence Security Services. But it's a terrible law because they say, well, we only want to monitor online behavior of people for phenomenon investigations. And it's called, what's a phenomenon investigation? You store personal data. It's about individuals. So it doesn't meet the practice, and it's a very bad law, and I already criticized it. And when it comes, when a proposal is made to talk about this bill, I will critically analyze it again.
And will the bill pass, or will they change it?
It depends. I mean, politically, when there is enough political parties saying this is a good idea, a law may pass early on, but it will be criticized by academics, but also because of media, because they also already wrote about it. So I think this law, they will amend it significantly, and then probably propose it again. Yeah.
So we're talking about the sort of the public actors and the private actors. Do these private security services also use methods that were recently invented by public security services, and perhaps also vice versa? How do they affect each other?
Sorry, I just turned myself on. I'm on. Yeah. So you're asking if there's the way in which they operate, if they say, I mean, definitely. I mean, I think that at least from the research that I've done, a lot of the private security officers, I call this the process of mimicking. They very much mimic the state police. I mean, the photo I started off with, the van, for example, it looks like a police vehicle, and the marketing manager of the company purposely looked at American TV shows to make it look like the police. So there's all sorts of mimicry happening. The same is with private military companies. And it's important also to say that a lot of owners of private security companies are ex-police officers. So it's completely interconnected, I would say. But I don't know if it's
I recognize it too. So many people in private industry, I think they have been law enforcement before, maybe intelligence even. But I do think a major difference, at least in the Netherlands, is that we provide our public law enforcement authorities or public intelligence and security services with certain powers to collect information. For example, they are able to hack computers of many individuals or maybe even bigger companies. They can commit crimes that are authorized before. In the Netherlands, our intelligence and security services do not have a license to kill, for example, so they cannot go that far. But they have more powers that private security companies do not have. And my other interest is in cybersecurity and digital investigations, and you can see there that also private security industry, and they can collect publicly available information. They can use kind of informants to gather information, but they are not. They cannot legally hack computers to gather information. They cannot engage in bulk interception. So I think that is a big difference. But there is a question, of course, also: is there oversight on these private intelligence companies? Do they indeed not engage in those kind of activities? So that's an open question for me still. But
yeah, would you say that there is enough oversight?
Well, in the Netherlands, again, I think it's all regulated for every state differently. In the Netherlands, we have a private security law. They have to get a license. Also, when you're a digital private security firm, you always have civil law. So when you had damages because they damaged something, you can go to a judge and ask for payment of these damages. The criminal law still applies, so you cannot conduct a crime, you may be prosecuted, but you don't see many cases coming up because of it. But there are some cases, there's some case law. Yeah. So,
are there any questions for Jan-Jaap, or perhaps also for Tessa? Yes.
I was wondering, many of those private offices and organizations, they are international. How do this conflict, or does it not conflict with Dutch law or national law?
Yeah, I'm not an all-knowing legal scholar, and I'm not specialized in this field. So, but there is there are regulations on conflict resolutions when different rules in different jurisdictions apply. I think what you can see in American companies that they also often have codes of conduct or self-regulation. I think that's not perfect, I do believe when you want to make clear as a society you can do this, but you cannot go beyond this. So you want to make clear, then you have to make regulations, and you don't rely on a code of conduct or stuff like that. So, but then you need to regulate it internationally, and then still, if it's not enforced, it's not perfect either. So. It's very, very difficult to regulate at all, I think. I do think if you're affected by a private security company, well, at least in the Netherlands, you can go to a Dutch judge and they can get the international company to pay a fine, for example. So it does work like that in the Netherlands, but it will be very different for other countries also. And even in the Netherlands, it won't be perfect. No.
Can, for example, the American intelligence services, can they collect data? Can they do like bulk interception in the Netherlands? And how's that regulated? Yeah, it's also interesting. Espionage is not regulated internationally, so it's very weird. It's like some say we pretend it doesn't exist. Some say it's allowed, but there are no treaties regulating espionage. So what regulates the behavior of American intelligence and security services is U.S. law. Mm-hmm. What regulates the behavior of Dutch intelligence and security services is Dutch law. Mm-hmm. A major difference between Dutch law and U.S. law is that in the United States, they provide more protection based on territoriality. So when it's about people on U.S. territory or Americans, they provide more safeguards than it's from people outside the United States. Or non-Americans. Mm-hmm. In the Netherlands, the same law applies to foreigners and Dutch people. So, for example, when you engage in hacking outside the Netherlands, or the U.S. engages in hacking in the Netherlands, we say Dutch law applies and all the same safeguards. In the United States, U.S. law applies with less safeguards. So. And still there are many states that provide more protection for their own nationals or people on their own territory. But in the Netherlands, and I've since a year or so in Germany also, people get the same protection. As in the United States?
Whether it's foreigners or Dutch people, you all the same law applies, and other states create a difference whether it's their own nationals or foreigners.
Yes. Again, a question for Jan-Jaap. Thank you for your presentation. First of all, you mentioned it briefly that there are other organizations that can mass survey the Dutch society, if I understood correctly. To be honest, you were very positive about the Dutch legislation concerning our secret service, security services, but do you think that it should be more strict to, let's say, the tax officers or other institutions in the Netherlands? Because I think were a bit negative there, and I'm keen on your opinion there.
Thanks for the great question. Definitely. I mean, when you talk about public surveillance, it's not just intelligence security services, the Dutch AIVD and MIVD, the General Intelligence Security Service, and the military security services. The act, what I was talking about, only applies to those two services, but we also have other law enforcement authorities that gather data, but even administrative authorities or municipalities. They collect information, and they use that information to decide what they want to do. So you collect information to decide whether someone committed fraud or not, or there's tax evasion, or they They get money from the government when they're not supposed to, basically. And laws apply also to those kind of authorities, and often it's just a data protection law. So there's a general Data Protection Act, and it applies also to these companies. But I think that the Dutch Data Protection Authority, they only have a few fines a year, basically, and it's always for private companies, and they don't have much attention for public authorities. But also about how do you collect the data, how far can they go, are they able to infiltrate on web shops to gather information or see whether drugs is illegally sold in their municipality. Those are important questions which are not addressed at all, basically, in the Netherlands. And it's not addressed in academic literature, it's not addressed in parliament. So I think lots needs to be done there. So yeah, I do think we need to regulate it more strictly, and there should be oversight on it. Well.
Yes.
I'm not sure whether I understood it correctly, but you mentioned earlier that that it may be possible that, for example, the United States are monitoring in the Netherlands because they can maybe. What I don't understand is that so the laws that are here in the Netherlands that should protect us against monitoring by our own government don't really protect us against, example, the United States. It's
sorry. Yeah, I think it's important to clarify then. What I wanted to explain is that espionage is conducted often off-road. So when the United States feel that people or organizations in the Netherlands pose a threat to their national security, they will engage in espionage in the Netherlands. And there has been instances in the past where the United States does engage in espionage in the Netherlands. They collect intelligence here, and they do that under their own laws. Of course, that's not allowed in the Netherlands. So there are basically two ways you can deal with it. When you detect it, and I say when you detect it, because when the NSA does it, it's very difficult to detect, but you could think of criminal law, but do you prosecute an intelligence officer that's in the United States, and who is it? And that will be very difficult. So what happens often is that it's dealt with diplomatically. So people talk to the embassy of the state that engages in espionage, and they have a firm talk, and maybe they will, I don't know the English translation, but you evict persons out of your country when you think this is an intelligence officer of a different state, of a foreign state. So that's how they deal with it in practice.
Yeah.
Thank you for the presentations. And so during the first presentation, we heard about like private security and public security as like two terms, two things next to each other, sometimes working together, sometimes in tension. And like the second presentation, so the focus was on like government and legislation. So what's the role of the state then in security, and can you imagine the privatization of this sector later on?
Would you like to go first, or should I?
You can go first.
Well, I mean, I think in a nutshell, I would say that the state is one of many players in the field of security. So even though we still have this very, as I mentioned, Westphalian, rather Eurocentric idea of the state as the sole provider of security, this is just no longer the case. And I mean, there's a lot of historical research that this has never been the case, so that the state, if we look at policing, for example, has always occurred alongside other actors as well. So that would be kind of my quick answer, is that the role of the state in security is one actor among many.
Yeah, I totally agree with it. But there, I mean, depending on the actor, different regulations apply. So legally, it's very complex and difficult also. But yeah, I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Is that an answer to your question? Any other questions? So Tessa, you have yeah, okay.
I have a question for Jan-Jaap. So you're part of this oversight body. And I was wondering, to what extent do you have access? So could you say a bit more, is this access unlimited? And could you say a bit more on how this works in practice?
I would tell you all about security at the Intelligence Security Services. Now, I can talk about it limitedly, but you know, I do think it's very important that an oversight body has access physically to intelligence and security services to, inspect whether they uphold the law. But you always go in with that goal. You don't go in and open files and look into systems and talk to people just for fun. It's always, you have a specific goal and you're looking for unlawful practice, basically. The goal is you want them to uphold the law and protect both national security and fundamental rights. So it's basically that's the focus of the investigations. But there are oversight bodies at different states that do not have access to the agencies. So they have to rely on interviews with people and what they say, and then you decide, do they uphold the law or not? But you can imagine that will be, I think, less good than when you have direct access. So, yeah, that's maybe a short answer to the question.
That's your question. Any other questions? Yes.
My question is that if I understood correctly, the definition of security is only security-based, and I have the idea, I'm not sure, that in the Dutch definition of police and security has more elements. I just wonder, because of your visiting different countries, if this definition, this Dutch definition, is also applying in South Africa or wherever. Because it has more than security, the Dutch definition.
So the question is, what does security mean?
If it's if this role, at least I understood this role of police and other organizations has more, at least in the Netherlands, has more more jobs, let's say, than only security. It has protection of the public. It also has information. Being in a different part between the law and people on the street. And I was wondering, just to get a better picture of your presentation, if this role is also applied in other countries.
I think I understand the question. To be honest, I think in my research I actually use the word policing more broadly rather than security, because I find security almost an impossible thing to define, and seen as this kind of utopian somehow state of being that we are trying to achieve. I mean, what does it mean to feel secure? Is this social security? Is this job security? Is this food security? I mean, it's a very... So I'm much more interested in understanding what do people themselves actually do to try and create some kind of safe space for themselves. And I think, yes, policing is much more than only crime prevention. And this would definitely be the case for some of the countries where I've done research. I would actually argue that policing is much more about creating and maintaining a certain social moral order in various ways. So yes, I think taking a broader perspective could also be applied elsewhere, if I understood your question correctly. Yeah, okay.
We also have a couple of questions from the online viewers. So there's, yeah.
What a surprise.
Yeah,
very hybrid.
That's
Yeah.
great.
They're here.
Yes.
Hi. Yeah.
So Bobby Vos, what, if anything, can the Netherlands learn from other countries for regulating security agencies?
I think the Dutch system is the best now. I like the UK system, where there is an oversight body for all intelligence services and not just two.
Mm-hmm.
So in the Netherlands, for example, the military gathers intelligence. We talked about the national coordinator before. We talked about tax authorities, etc. So you could think about creating an oversight body also for these type of companies. But for example, in Belgium, they have an oversight body for law enforcement and intelligence, and for intelligence and national security, and that's also an interesting divide. So those are two things when we talk about oversight that we can learn from other countries. I do think, states have different legal traditions. So in the Netherlands, it's really about law in the books. So we regulate, we stipulate what kind of powers intelligence and security services have. And other states, they rely more on case law or more on internal guidelines to regulate these kind of things. And I like that we stipulate it in law. So if you have a lawyer, or you are specialized, or you are very, very interested, then you could learn what these powers entail and what they mean. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah. And relating to the private security industry? Can the Netherlands, I know it's not...
Well, yeah, I mean, I definitely think that the South African regulatory authority is worldwide seen as one of the most robust accountability structures in the world. I mean, one of the problems is just it's not always implemented. So, I mean, the law can exist, but if it's not enforced or upheld, and this is definitely a problem, so the lesson learned would be uphold the law in a way. But also just to add on to this discussion, because I'm actually currently now involved in a project on police oversight in Kenya, something completely different. And I'm thinking about this concept of the oversight overload. So what you have in Kenya a lot is you actually have a lot of different organizations that are there to oversee the police, and it's actually unclear who is responsible for what at times. So you have a lot of different organizations looking into the same cases at the same time.
Yeah.
So that could also be a lesson learned. Have clear boundaries of who is responsible for what.
Because that's basically what you're saying as well, that there's an oversight overload. At least there's too many organizations doing the oversight work. And
well, there's I mean, the evaluation on the Act on Intelligence and Security Services. Also, we're talking about unclear responsibilities, and sometimes an oversight body that interprets the law differently from intelligence and security services. Should there be a judge to decide who's right, basically, or not? So it's important to talk about that and to evaluate also, and then also decide on it and act on it. So that is also a concern. Yeah.
So a last question from Samir Aloui. Where do you go when intelligence of any kind goes rogue on you? That's a good question.
Does he mean an agent goes rogue?
Call your mother.
So what I'm thinking about, maybe it's about going rogue, is that you disregard all regulations and you do what you please. And I think you had a picture of Blackwater. That's also about going rogue and criminal law is there to make people responsible for their actions. So that is a mechanism. And I think some people of Blackwater were prosecuted, and some weren't. But it works in part. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Maybe this is something that we're going to talk about next time as well, about blacklist and being put on a list, and where do you go and how do you get off the list. But that's next time. That's on the 4th of November. For now, I'd really like to thank our guests, Jan-Jaap Oerlemans and Tessa Diphoorn.
Thank you.
And so I hope to see you next time on the 4th of July. Then Marieke de Goede is here.
November, 4th of
November. July? Did I say July?
Independence Day, different story.
Summer.
Bye.